Thanks for listening to Curious Cat, the podcast that examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. I'm your host, Jennifer Holtz. Join me every week as I explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit. Welcome to Curious Cat. While I was researching the history of California, the history of Florida, and the Pacific Crest Trail, there was a common thread: atrocities done to the first people to inhabit North America. I've hiked to places where blood was actually shed, and sometimes I found a marker, sometimes I found a statue, but often nothing. This is a history we need to remember collectively, a pain that should be held and looked at straight on, again, collectively, and a healing that can only happen if we're honest about this part of United States history. It feels like Thanksgiving is a good time to have this conversation. I hope you think so too. Let's get into it. First, let's look at the 1830 Indian Removal Act. I found an overview from the Office of the Historian who writes this: the U.S. government used treaties as one means to displace Indians from their tribal lands, a mechanism that was strengthened with the Removal Act of 1830. In cases where this failed, the government sometimes violated both treaties and Supreme Court rulings to facilitate the spread of European Americans westward across the continent. As the 19th century began, land-hungry Americans poured into the backcountry of the coastal South and began moving toward and into what would later become the states of Alabama and Mississippi. Since Indian tribes living there appeared to be the main obstacle to westward expansion, white settlers petitioned the federal government to remove them, although Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe argued that the Indian tribes in the Southeast should exchange their land for lands west of the Mississippi River. They did not take steps to make this happen. Indeed, the first major transfer of land occurred only as a result of war. In 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson led an expedition against the Creek Indians, climaxing in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and this occurred in present-day Alabama near the Georgia border, where Jackson's force soundly defeated the Creeks and destroyed their military power. He then forced upon the Indians a treaty whereby they surrendered to the United States over 20 million acres of their traditional land, about one half of present-day Alabama and 1/5 of Georgia. Over the next decade, Jackson led the way in the Indian removal campaign, helping to negotiate 9 of the 11 major treaties to remove Indians. Under this kind of pressure, Native American tribes, specifically the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, realized that they could not defeat the Americans in war. The appetite of the settlers for land would not abate, so the Indians adopted a strategy of appeasement. They hoped that if they gave up a good deal of their land, they could keep at least some part of it. The Seminole tribe of Florida resisted. In the Second Seminole War, that ran from 1835 to 1842, and the Third Seminole War, which ran from 1855 to 1858. However, neither appeasement nor resistance worked. From a legal standpoint, the United States Constitution empowered Congress to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, end quote. In early treaties negotiated between the federal government government and the Indian tribes, the latter typically acknowledge themselves to, quote, be under the protection of the United States of America and of no other sovereign whosoever, end quote. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, and his 2 terms ran through 1837, he decided to build a systematic approach to Indian removal on the basis of these legal precedents. To achieve his purpose, Jackson encouraged Congress to adopt the Removal Act of 1830. The act established a process whereby the president could grant land west of the Mississippi River to Indian tribes that agreed to give up their homelands. As incentives, the law allowed the Indians financial and material assistance to travel to their new locations and start new lives, and guaranteed that the Indians would live on their own property under the protection of the U.S. government forever. With the act in place, Jackson and his followers were free to persuade, bribe, and threaten tribes into signing removal treaties and leaving the Southeast. In general terms, Jackson's government succeeded. By the end of his presidency, he had signed into law almost 70 removal treaties, the result of which was to move nearly 50,000 Eastern Indians to Indian Territory, defined as the region belonging to the U.S. west of the Mississippi River, but excluding the states of Missouri and Iowa, as well as the territory of Arkansas, and opened millions of acres of rich land east of the Mississippi to white settlers. Despite the vastness of the Indian Territory, the government intended that the Indians' destination would be a more confined area, what later became eastern Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation resisted, however, challenging in court the Georgia laws that restricted their freedoms on tribal lands. In his 1831 ruling on Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that, quote, the Indian Territory is admitted to compose a part of the United States, end quote, and affirmed that the tribes were, quote, domestic dependent nations, end quote, and their, quote, their relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian, end quote. However, the following year, the Supreme Court reversed itself and ruled that Indian tribes were indeed sovereign and immune from Georgia laws. President Jackson, nonetheless, refused to heed the court's decision. He obtained the signature of a Cherokee chief agreeing to relocation in the Treaty of the New Echota, which Congress ratified against the protests of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay in 1835. The Cherokee signing party represented only a faction of the Cherokee, and the majority followed Principal Chief John Ross in a desperate attempt to hold on to their land. This attempt faltered in 1838 when, under the guns of federal troops and Georgia state militia, the Cherokee tribe were forced to the dry plains across the Mississippi. The best evidence indicates that between 3,000 and 4,000 out of the 15,000 to 16,000 Cherokees died en route from the brutal conditions of the Trail of Tears, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. With the exception of a small number of Seminoles still resisting removal in Florida, by the 1840s from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, no Indian tribes resided in the American South. Through a combination of coerced treaties and the contravention of treaties and judicial determination, the United States government succeeded in paving the way for the westward expansion and the unincorporation of new territories as part of the United States. Okay, I'm just popping in to remind you that in that Medicine Lake and Hospital Rock episode, I shared some history specific to the Pacific Northwest. And I wanted to do a quick recap in case you missed that episode or that part. And in it, I said that I had to return to something that was mentioned in passing earlier in that episode by the National Park Service. It was the Modoc War. I had not heard of it before and found out more from Wandering Mind Travel, who camped in this area for a few days with her partner. She wrote this, and some of it, I want to preface, is accurate and some is inaccurate, though I feel like her heart is in the right place. But this is what she wrote, and then I'll correct the record after. Our final morning, we packed up our car, but we were not nearly done with our trip. We spent the morning learning the history of Captain Jack and the Modoc Indian War. This was a timely reminder of the ugly history of this country we sometimes try to gloss over or ignore. It may be easier to look the other way, she says, but confronting this history and remembering this history is important. This is a history where people, because of the color of their skin and their beliefs, were forced off their land. The place was their home, all because people with a different color skin and different set of beliefs were powerful enough to do that. This is a history that must not be forgotten. The war began in November 1872 when a handful of Modoc Indians decided to move back to their home. This set off a series of conflicts between the Indians and white settlers. Eventually, a group of Indians led by Captain Jack retreated to the lava beds where they were joined by others. There were 50 or 60 warriors and their families who made a stand here. Later named Captain Jack's Stronghold, this area of lava bed was home for this group of people for months of fighting against a vastly larger U.S. Army. The war ended in June of the following year with the defeat of the Modoc Indians. Captain Jack and other leaders were hanged, and most remaining Modoc who were at the stronghold were relocated to Oklahoma, a place so very far from their home. As we walked these places where such a tragedy had occurred, I could only hope that we have learned to do better, to be better as a country and as human beings. So, seeking more, I turned to Oregon History Project, which wrote this. The Modoc War was fought over land. The Modocs refused to move from their traditional homeland to the Klamath Reservation, demanding instead a small reservation near Tule Lake. The white pioneers who had settled on Modoc lands were equally stubborn in their refusal to accept the presence of the Modocs. The result was violent conflict. In the fall of 1872, a regular Army contingent dispatched without the knowledge or permission of the region's commanding officer arrived at a Modoc village near Tule Lake to forcibly remove its inhabitants to the Klamath Reservation. Fearing persecution by the numerically superior Klamath, the Modocs refused to move to the reservation. A firefight broke out, and the Modocs fled to the nearby lava fields, where they made their final stand. Fewer than 75 Modoc warriors managed to hold off a force of over 1,000 U.S. Army and volunteer troops for several months. The standoff in the lava fields around Tule Lake was one of the few examples of siege warfare in the annals of the Indian Wars. By the time the conflict was over, dozens of American soldiers and volunteers had been killed, including General E.R. Canby, the leader of the U.S. Army contingent, and dozens more were wounded. The Modocs lost more than 20 people, including 4 of their leaders, who were hung as war criminals. Most of those who survived were sent to Oklahoma, where many died in exile. In the end, the federal government spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to remove the Modocs, substantially more than the $20,000 it would have cost to buy that small plot of land over which the war was fought. There's a lot to unpack here. First, this sick, simpleton way of seeing all First Peoples by those Americans. I can just see it. They were thinking stick the Modoc people where the Klamath tribe already was in bigger numbers, not thinking that groups of people are different and that the Modoc might be under threat somewhere else. And second, just that BS conflict alone. There are now, and so definitely back then, vast amounts of wide open space in the West, and they couldn't leave the Modoc alone. Find a different place to inhabit. Oh, and also, when you treat human beings as subhumans, you don't speak with them, find ways to communicate with them and hear why they might not want to be relocated to the Klamath Reservation. Besides past histories between groups there, this area encompassed what we later called Crater Lake. This area was deeply feared and avoided at all costs by the Modoc people, whose oral tradition said this was a cursed land festering in evil, a place where dark entities walked the surrounding forests, where people disappeared. And guess what? The Modoc were spot on. I covered a teeny fraction of the cases of missing people from Crater Lake in my Cascadia Crater Lake episode. The Modoc knew this, and they know it now. I'm realizing more and more that my ill ease with the Shasta area has more to do with these bloody conflicts than the mountain itself. The land retains that death, that wronging. Like the Medicine Lake volcano, that awful energy spreads wide and deep. I still wanted to understand more about the Klamath tribe, and deep breath here. This is what I found on Oregon History Project. Quote, when white explorers entered the Klamath Basin in the 1820s, the Klamath Indians occupied the upper Klamath Lake area, which included Klamath Marsh and the Sprague and Williamson rivers. The Modoc people inhabited the Tule Lake area of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Yahuskin land bordered Klamath territory to the west and extended east into present-day Lake and Harney counties. Native uprisings and valuable tribal land, however, convinced the U.S. government to relocate many Native groups onto reservations throughout the country. The Treaty of 1864 merged the Klamath, the Modoc, and the Yahuskin tribes into the Klamath tribe and onto a single reservation in the Klamath Basin. The reservation contained thousands of acres of ponderosa pine. The treaty provided for a sawmill, and proceeds from timber and lumber sales funded a tribal government and a health clinic. By the 1950s, though, the Klamath tribe was one of the wealthiest Native groups in the nation. In 1954, despite Bureau of Indian Affairs and tribal opposition, Congress passed the Klamath Termination Act, which terminated federal recognition of the Klamath tribe. The act discontinued federal social services such as free education and organized tribal lands into national forest areas, so they created a name. They lumped three tribes together in the 1800s and wiped out their names with a single swath of a pen. But then now they're wiping out the entire tribe of Klamath tribe that they created because they're wealthy. They had the resources they needed. I'm just burning up mad about this. This U.S. government map, which they show in the links in the show notes, distributed in January 1961, explained how Klamath tribal lands would be organized into U.S. national forest lands. According to anthropologist Patrick Haenel, the Klamath were targeted for termination because of their timber assets and because Congress was convinced that the Klamath people were virtually assimilated into white society, and somehow that was threatening to them, meaning they no longer needed special assistance. By the 1970s, the majority of tribal members were living below the national poverty line. Related to the tragic and awful legislation of the 1830 Indian Removal Act is the Trail of Tears. I've heard this term countless times over the course of my life and in school, but I never could explain it back to someone. Here's some information from National Geographic History, who writes, the Trail of Tears was the forced removal by the U.S. government of Native Americans east of the Mississippi River during the 1830s. On May 28, 1830, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, marking the government's clear-cut push to remove Native American tribes from east of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act opened land that indigenous peoples had previously called home to white settlement and the expansion of slavery, further codifying injustices at the federal level that had long been underway. By early 1800s, the U.S. U.S. government and several state governments had already frequently pushed indigenous tribes farther and farther west. Violence, threats, deception, and legal agreements, often treaties, were tactics used to transfer indigenous-held land to white people. Though there was significant Native American resistance, many of these earlier efforts at ethnic cleansing were successful. These anti-indigenous policies, coupled with the spread of diseases transmitted by settlers, had severely decreased the population of indigenous peoples in North America. However, there was still a substantial indigenous presence east of the Mississippi River. Tribes living in what is now the U.S. Southeast at the time included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole tribes. By the 1800s, these nations were known collectively as the Five Civilized Tribes because they had adopted aspects of white settler culture. Pressured by the U.S. government, many copied the ways settlers dressed, their education system, their practice of Christianity, their use of plantation agriculture, and their enslavement of people of African descent. Originally, enslavement by Native Americans was not the same as that practiced by the white settlers. Being enslaved was not an inherited or permanent status. The enslaved could be adopted into the family. This changed as the cultures and beliefs of these tribes became virtually identical to the U.S. Still, this, quote, civilized practices of the five tribes did not stop the white settlers' growing demands for their land. Two historic events, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the War of 1812, sped this land grab. The Louisiana Purchase bought the U.S. government the exclusive right to purchase or forcibly take lands from various indigenous governments. Lacking enough funds to pay veterans of the War of 1812, the U.S. government offered them land in what are now the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Arkansas, lands occupied by indigenous peoples. They gave away what wasn't theirs to give away. As in the Southeast, Native American tribes occupied huge swaths of what the U.S. called the Northwest Territory, now the U.S. states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. An alliance of tribes from this region, including the Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee, led by a war chief of the Miami tribe, Little Turtle, had resisted expansion and defeated U.S. forces in 1790 and 1791. Many Native American nations likewise fought against the U.S. expansion during the War of 1812, which pitted the U.S. against Great Britain. The Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Potawatomi, and Creek, among other tribes, allied for this purpose under the leadership of Shawnee war leader Tecumseh. From the Ohio Valley, he envisioned a confederation of nations spanning from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico to fight against U.S. territorial expansion. Similarly, the British wanted to stop U.S. expansion to protect its Canadian territory. To help in this effort, the British fought to keep the Great Lakes under Indigenous control. Thus, Tecumseh's alliance joined the British in the fight against the U.S. during the War of 1812. British forces and the Native Americans provided each other with military support, supplies, and aid. Tecumseh led an effective campaign against the U.S. invasion into Canada and the Northwest Territory, winning several victories, including at Fort Detroit. The indigenous British alliance largely fell apart with Tecumseh's death in a battle near Ontario, Canada, in October 1813. Afterwards, Native American military resistance was no longer strong enough to threaten U.S. forces in the region. However, this did not end Native American resistance in the Great Lakes or in other parts of North America. A series of legal treaties, mostly after violence against Native American communities, preceded the 1830 Indian Removal Act. From 1814 to 1824, 11 treaties were signed that provided the legal framework to redistribute land from southeastern indigenous peoples to whites. U.S. Army officer Andrew Jackson helped negotiate 9 of these treaties. From 1813 to 1814, Jackson fought alongside the Cherokee and the Lower Creeks against the Upper Creeks, known as the Red Stick Creeks. The Red Stick Creeks had allied with the British to maintain their more traditional culture. Jackson also invaded Spanish-controlled Florida to fight against the Seminoles for their role in helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Jackson went on to serve as president, as we know, promoting and signing that Indian Removal Act of 1830 into law. Not all members of Congress supported this. Tennessee Rep. Davy Crockett was a vocal opponent of the proposal. Removal of Eastern Native American peoples to west of the Mississippi River was intended to be voluntary. Some Native American communities complied, while others, including many of the nations of the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw of southeastern North America, did not take the deal to give up their lands to move west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw tried to negotiate with white settlers and the U.S. government, offering some lands to remain in place. Most of the Seminole Nation fought against their removal in what became known as the Second and Third Seminole Wars, which we touched upon earlier. The Cherokee used the U.S. legal system to fight against their removal. Though they won their case in the Supreme Court, Jackson and the U.S. military did not honor that decision. This forced removal, which occurred throughout the late 1830s, became known as the Trail of Tears. From 1827 to 1838, about 23,000 Creek people were forced into Indian territory, thousands of whom died on the 3-month journey. In all, more than 46 to 60,000 Native Americans were forced, sometimes by the U.S. military, to abandon their homes and relocate to Indian Territory, which became the state of Oklahoma. This did not include several thousand more people of African descent, those who were enslaved and those who were not, nor did it include whites married to indigenous partners. The Indian Removal Act marked the completion of ethnically cleansing the indigenous peoples from east of the Mississippi River. In the years that followed, subsequent federal policies would continue to uproot indigenous peoples, clear the way for additional U.S. expansion, and remove Native peoples from their communities, their homelands. Today, the Trail of Tears is a national historic trail stretching from Tennessee to Oklahoma. It specifically chronicles the removal of the Cherokee from 1838 to 1839. I'm reminded of the Native people in and around Colorado who, after meeting with President Abraham Lincoln, were instructed to hang an American flag near the barren soil that they were relocated to as a sign of peace. But going against the president's instructions, a rogue Colorado governor instructed troops to wipe out every person, every man, woman, and child in the area, and they did so on a quiet Sunday morning. 2 officers at least defied orders, and they meticulously kept track of the murders, the rapes, and other violent atrocities perpetrated on the people that day, sending a thorough accounting to President Lincoln. One of these officers was murdered in cold blood days after his wedding for being a traitor on the streets of Denver. But in my book, that guy was a hero for holding those awful violent sickos accountable in some way. History Colorado Museum has an incredible and very emotional display that recounts the ways Native people lived before those land-hungry Americans changed everything. You can't get through this immaculate presentation without crying, I guarantee it. One final note, I hinted at it, but the land the Native people were forced onto often had no natural resources, zero fresh water, no natural place to fish or hunt or grow crops. We are talking desolate, high desert country. Harsh doesn't even begin to describe the place. It's just wrong. I asked AI, can you hike the Trail of Tears? And side note, these are the questions we need to ask AI to inform the machine and programming of these atrocities. Keep the search engines primed to give this information, not bury it, not let this history get lost or eaten by the internet. So again, I asked, can you hike the Trail of Tears? And here was the response. Yes, you can hike parts of the Trail of Tears, though it's not a single continuous trail, but rather a historic corridor across 9 states with multiple sites and various hiking, paddling, and biking routes for experiencing its history and landscape. The National Park Service provides an interactive map and a list of places to go, including specific trails within state parks like Trail of Tears State Park in Missouri. It went a little further, saying how to hike the Trail of Tears. Number 1, use the National Park Service map, and they give the link for that. Then number 2, find specific trails. Look for designated hiking trails near historic sites, such as the Unicoi Turnpike or trails at Trail of Tears State Park. Number 3, consider other activities. You can also bike, paddle, or horseback ride the trail in different sections. Number 4, be aware of the conditions. Parts of the original trail may be on private land, so plan to visit designated public areas and be prepared for conditions in different states. And then they remind us it's not a single trail. It's a historic route with 17 different paths, and it's not a single marked trail. The trail extends through 9 states: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. And hiking the trail offers a way to connect with the historical landscape and remember the forced removal and survival of the Cherokee people. I was interested to know a smidgen more about the Trail of Tears State Park in Missouri. If you live nearby and have never been, it's important to make a trip there. Maybe even suggest your children's school take a field trip there. This is how we remember the past and honor those that were harmed, killed, hurt, forcibly removed, and begin the path to healing those wounds however we can. Here's a description from the website. Gain a better understanding of one of the saddest chapters in American history at Trail of Tears State Park. 9 of the 13 Cherokee detachments being forcibly relocated to Oklahoma crossed the Mississippi River at this location of the park during harsh winter conditions in 1838 and 1839. Exhibits at the park's Visitors Center tell the tale of the thousands who perished on the forced march. In addition to interpreting the area's cultural history, the park offers opportunities to engage and recreate in this natural beauty. There is hope on the horizon. I have to share that before I close. My alma mater, University of Washington, writes this: healing generational trauma with culturally humble care. UW Medicine shares this story. Native Americans are facing a mental health crisis today. They are at least twice as likely to experience serious psychological distress as white, African American, Asian, and Latina people. They also face a higher risk of poverty, violence, and trauma, yet they have limited access to social services and health care. For Native people in rural communities, healthcare access is harder to access, making the disparities even greater. It took generations to get to where we are, and it will take generations to recover, says Dr. Dakota Lane. As medical director of the Lumi Tribal Health Center and as a member of the Lumi Nation, original inhabitants of the Northwestern Washington area, he sees the effects of healthcare inequity every day in his community. Now, through a partnership between the Advancing Integrated Mental Health Solutions Center at the University of Washington and the Lumi Tribal Health Center, A new program is training UW psychiatry residents to deliver culturally humble telepsychiatry care. This donor-supported program provides critical telehealth care to tribal members, and with continued support, its founders seek to expand the program's services to more patients in the area. Historical trauma, unequal treatment, and race-based prejudices in patient care, both inside and outside tribal healthcare systems, are all factors that impact mental health in Native communities. A lot of American Indian communities are in almost a recovery period, says Lane. My generation is trying to process what happened to our immediate ancestors, our grandparents and great-grandparents, and trying to understand why we suffer from all of this trauma now. One major part of this historical trauma involves residential schools, also called boarding schools, in both the U.S. and Canada. Native American children were taken from their families and sent to live at residential schools until they turned the age of 18. At these schools, they were forbidden to speak their native languages, made to wear Western clothes, forced to give up their traditional practices, and forcibly converted to Christianity. Children were punished, often physically, for speaking a native language. Many of their families were prevented from visiting them. In the Pacific Northwest, there were residential schools in Tulalip, Washington, Linden, Washington, and Salem, Oregon. Starting in the 1880s, Lumi children were sent to these and other schools in the area. Residential schools were still in operation as recently as the 1970s, well within living memory. For generations of children, this forced separation from their families, tribes, and cultural traditions had severe, lifelong effects on their personal relationships and mental health. The effects persist today as substance use problems, mental health issues, challenges with healthy parenting, and many other areas. If you're stressed without a safe place, you tend to develop unhealthy habits and poor relationships with other people, including your family, Lane says. So they come home from the schools and have their kids of their own, but they're somewhat detached from the community and don't really know how to appropriately raise a child or handle anger and other emotions. Another present-day trauma is a human rights crisis known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For decades, Native American and Alaska Native communities have struggled with high rates of assault, abduction, and murder of women and girls. A 2016 study by the National Institute of Justice found that 84.3% of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime, including 56.1% who have experienced sexual violence. Providing effective and compassionate mental health care to Native communities requires a deep understanding of these and other traumas, as well as a culturally humble approach. Lane isn't just the medical director of the Lumi Tribal Health Center. He's also the Lumi Nation's first physician from its own community, having grown up on the Lumi Reservation and nearby Bellingham. As a tribal member, Lane has a deeply personal understanding of his community's trauma and its resilience. Many Native Americans have found strength in reconnecting to their cultural identities and traditions. He fondly recalls salmon fishing with his father and grandfather around the San Juan Islands as a child, and the deeply meaningful ceremony of receiving his Lumi name, Mimusia. Early on, Lane felt called to serve his people as a physician, and after medical school, he returned to the reservation in 2016 to practice family medicine at the Lumi Tribal Health Center. In 2019, he hired Dr. George Bud Vana as the Tribal Center's psychiatrist. One of Vana's first priorities, though, was creating a resident training program with the UW School of Medicine. There's a real interest, he said, among residents to help underserved populations. We wanted to do that in a way that gave residents the cultural humility and cultural psychiatry training while allowing the community to benefit from psychiatric access and care, end quote. Vanna teamed up with the Ames Center's Dr. Jessica Whitfield, a UW instructor for psychiatry and behavioral sciences, to develop a 6-month integrated care rotation for 2 psychiatric residents per year. The residents directly provide telehealth care to clinic patients under the supervision of Vanna and Whitfield. Through the program, residents also learn about the history and cultural context of the Lumi Nation, which fosters cultural humility in delivering mental health care. One of the unique things about this rotation, thanks to donor support, is how much time residents can take with patients, Vanna says. It's difficult to be culturally humble when you have 15 minutes to get through a questionnaire and make a plan. Longer visits give us time for cultural understanding and curiosity, and it's been really powerful for a lot of our patients and residents, end quote. The residency program is part of a larger partnership between UW School of Medicine and the Lumi Nation that was formalized in the fall of 2022. The partnership creates more training opportunities for medical students and trainees to learn at the Lumi Tribal Health Center. The ultimate goal is to inspire more physicians to serve tribal communities, but there are plenty of immediate benefits for all the participants. Native trainees can gain knowledge that they can take back to their own tribes. Non-Native trainees can learn about caring for tribal communities and cross-cultural communication, and tribal members can feel seen, heard, and supported while receiving care. Patients here in Lumi know that psychiatric care is valuable, says Lane, when they're able to access a psychiatrist in a clinic they trust. It's a huge relief. Bringing in these residents helps more families get access to psychiatric care. Currently, the Tribal Health Center is building a new medical clinic to better serve their diverse community. Lumi tribal members, Native Americans from other tribes in the region, and non-Native locals all use the center's services. Construction was originally planned for spring 2020 and was put on hold during the pandemic, but the center is expected to open in spring 2023, so it's open now. The new facility expands the health center ability to offer adult and pediatric primary care, dental health, physical therapy, behavioral health services, childcare, and more. As the center continues to grow to meet the region's needs, continued donor support will help the resident training program grow along with it. When it comes to helping people heal from the generational impacts of trauma, there are no easy answers. And Lane and Vanna know that finding solutions will take time and effort, but they're not giving up. Our clinic is here to help create a healthy community, Lane says. We are picking up the pieces and starting to put them together. This article was written by Stephanie Perry, and find the links in the show notes. And if you'd like to help Dr. Lane, Dr. Vanna, or Dr. Whitfield improve healthcare equality for Native Americans by training psychiatry residents in culturally humble care, make a gift to the American Indian and Alaska Native Access Fund. Thanks for listening to Curious Cat. Until next week, stay curious. I love you.